Though it may look small from shore, Seal Island reveals itself to be an imposing silhouette of an island. The crashing waves slam against craggy granite, sharp cliffs, and a tall rock spine cut across your view of the horizon. But this formidable island isn't just a place of danger. It holds a cradle of life between the boulders. Black and white seabirds whiz by in a flurry of flapping, filling the seas and skies. Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge hosts the largest puffin colony of the Seabird Institute's 7 research islands. These lovable birds are a part of the alcid family, tuxedoed fish-eating birds also known as auks. However, they're not the only alcids that call these islands their summer home. Puffins can be seen rafting on the water alongside their cousins, the guillemots and razorbills, as they splash and dive for all their favorite fish. But just how do all of these different birds survive and thrive on Seal Island and its 65 acres? Today, we'll be exploring the lives of puffins, guillemots, and razorbills on this breeding island and learn the differences in how they raise their chicks. We are so lucky to be joined by a special guest who is broadcasting live from Seal Island itself. I'm Gloria Jin, the Communications and Outreach Assistant for the National Audubon Society Seabird Institute. Joining me today is the fabulous Coco Faber, Seal Island Supervisor. So thank you so much, Coco, for joining us today. And without further ado, let's get into it. Coco, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little about your role at the Seabird Institute? From my understanding, it's your 9th year with the program.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Coco. It is my 9th year working for the project, but I hopped around to a few different islands before settling in on Seal. This is my 5th year working here and my 4th as the supervisor. And so that means that I'm here from when we open the island in mid-May to or early May until we close in mid-September. And as the island supervisor, I lead a crew of 4 to 5 people who are here for the summer to monitor all of our seabird species.
It looks like even for the researchers, coexistence on a seabird island is the name of the game. So today's live chat will focus all about the different breeding strategies that all of these alcids employ on Seal Island to raise their chicks year after year. So if you have any questions, we'll be available to answer all of them at the end of tonight's event. So you can drop any questions you may have into the comments wherever you are that you're watching from. So without further ado, Coco, would you like to get into all the different alcids that nest on Seal Island?
Yeah, so as a lot of our viewers know, we have 3 species of alcid who are in the auk family that actually breed on Seal Island. So those are Atlantic puffins, razorbills, and black guillemots. And those are all pretty hefty seabirds that have a variety of black and white plumages and then little splashes of color on them. And then sometimes we do also see common murres, but they don't breed here. And so we're not going to talk about them today.
Not today. But wow, that's amazing. Seal Island can host so many different kinds of these incredible seabirds every summer too. So what are some of the different breeding strategies that let them kind of ensure their chicks make it to fledging as big as healthy and possible?
Well, there are a bunch of different interesting similarities and differences within their breeding strategies. So we're going to go through a few of those. So one of the first things that's interesting to us as researchers who are spending a lot of time looking in and under rock crevices for these burrows is the small similarities and differences between them. So in a lot of other places where puffins breed, they actually nest in sod burrows that are sometimes were originally rabbit burrows or made by other mammals that they dig out. But here we are a granite island, and so they nest in rocky burrows, usually these distinct enclosed burrows that have some nesting material like grass or seaweed, or as our longtime viewers know, a lot of grass that Willie likes to bring into the burrow. But the razorbills also nest in rocky burrows, but sometimes in these more open areas with a little less nesting material. And they are sometimes under larger rocks with multiple pairs in the same space. And then the guillemots make our lives a little bit easier because they tend to nest in these slightly more open crevices that are a little easier to look into, but like in our ham burrow, they sometimes have barely enough room to turn around in there. So they'll be in like these little slot canyons. And then they each have a little bit of a different timing schedule on the island. So when we first get to the island in early May, we do see all three of our alcid species around. Most of them have gotten here before we do. So the puffins will arrive on the island in late April, and then they'll have laid their eggs by early May. And the last couple years, very early in May. They'll hatch their chicks around mid-June, and then they'll start fledging in mid to late July through early August. The razorbills are a little bit ahead of them, so they'll arrive also in the early spring, but they usually lay their eggs even earlier than the puffins do by a little bit. And we'll find our first chicks in the first few days of June. I think this year is June 3rd. And then they actually fledge typically by around the end of June through mid-July. So we actually only have one chick left in a burrow that we're monitoring who's holding out. And then the guillemots actually never migrate very far from their breeding grounds in the winter, so they may come back even earlier to the island in the late winter and spring. And they'll start courting in May, lay eggs in late May, and then have chicks hatch typically in late June, and they'll start to fledge from late July through August. So fairly similar, but there are some slight differences there. One of the bigger differences between some of them are in clutch sizes. So we know our puffins and our razorbills both lay one egg. Their eggs look very different from each other. So the puffins have that one white egg. It's a medium size, it's like rounded oval. It's a little bit pointy at the end. The razorbills also only lay one egg. Their eggs are a little bit bigger, and they are also this beautiful light blue-green color with some speckling on them. And they typically are a little like more elongated and pointier. And then our guillemots are the ones that throw off the alcid egg trend because they will lay one or two eggs. So we do have some burrows that have just one egg, but a lot of them will have two. And they look very similar to a razorbill egg, except they're just smaller. And they will actually often wait to incubate the first egg until they've laid the second, which means that for a lot of them, both of those chicks will hatch pretty close together, even if they've been laid like a day or two apart. And then once their chicks hatch, all of these species have slightly different foraging strategies to feed those chicks. So our puffins are mostly foraging offshore, mostly for fish, and they can catch fish and then keep swimming around and catch more fish. And they have these serrations in their mouth that allow them to hold pretty hefty bill loads of many fish at once. And then razorbills have a relatively similar strategy. They also mostly feed their chicks fish, and they can hold more than one. Typically, from just what we see here on seal, they usually have fewer fish that are a little larger than the puffins, and they eat a lot of sand lance and herring early on in the season. And then our guillemots, again, are the ones that are just a little different. So they actually forage inshore, really different waters. So rather than diving really deep like our puffins and our razorbills are, they are going to more shallow water closer to shore, and they're catching prey that is near on the bottom. So that these are termed like benthic foragers, the benthic area. And they mostly eat red things. So they eat a lot of rock gunnel, shanty, and sculpin. And that's part of how they get that red pigmentation. And when we have really little chicks where they're all just covered in down, you can actually see their skin a little bit, and their skin is red from all of those red fishes.
Hey.
And then finally, when we get to fledging, so our puffin chicks fledge out of the burrows alone. They are ready to go out into the world, typically at like 35 to 50 days old, and they will be in a good year. They'll be relatively close to an adult's weight, still not quite as big, but able to forage for themselves. So they're like a fully formed puffin out in the world then. And the razorbills have a very different strategy. So though the razorbill chicks will also go out of the burrow typically at night. Um, but they do so much earlier. So they can actually fledge within 2 weeks, although it's usually between like 14 to 25 days. And they will be fully feathered, like you can see here, but they're only maybe a quarter to a third of their eventual weight. And they are accompanied on the water by their fathers, who will actually continue to feed them while they're floating around. And then our guillemots also fledge at night. um, but they fledge on their own, like the puffin chicks, and they are full, fully able to forage and feed themselves, and at kind of a similar age range to the puffin, so about 30 to 50 days old. One of the really cool things about the guillemots, because they have these two, they can lay two eggs and have two chicks, we'll often see that what we call the B chick, or the chick that hatches second, they're often a little bit smaller and they can have a hard time competing with the A chick for enough food, which our viewers have seen in the cam burrow over the years. But if a B chick can survive long enough, the A chick will leave the burrow. They're feeding themselves out in the ocean, and suddenly the parents are only feeding the B chick. And we can see them gain a lot of weight really quickly at the end and fledge at a really healthy weight. So that's always like a really interesting strategy to see for those B chicks. If they just hang on, they can really do well. And I think
That's
that gets us through everything.
Yeah, no, that is actually just so incredible to hear about. I think there's a lot of things that you don't really think about or even consider or have the capacity to know without just like someone, I guess, on the inside or on the outside, on out on Seal Island to kind of tell us all about this. And I don't know, I just find the guillemots so fascinating, like what you said about having the red pigmentation even on their skin, them kind of being the kind of silly ones that go into the benthic to forage or kind of go inland and they stick mostly to the shore too, unlike the other birds that are definitely more out in the open ocean. And so it's really cool to kind of see all the range in these alcids. And it also shows that there's no one right answer for being successful in raising their chicks. Um, whether it's laying one or two eggs, the timing of the laying, the hatching, how they fledge. Um, I think the razorbill fledging is actually super fascinating. The fact that the father actually will follow the chick out to see and continue feeding it. And even just the types of burrows that they've chosen. The alcids, they've adapted to it all. Um, and I mean, monitoring all of these birds and getting to know all of these little quirks that they have seem like such a lot of work, especially on such a big island like Seal. So what are some of the major projects that you and your research team have to work on every season?
We do have a lot of different studies that we do, which is honestly one of the most interesting and exciting parts of this job and getting to be here. So we do a lot of long-term monitoring. So we're contributing to these really large data sets from over the years. But we do annual censuses for our terns, eiders, gulls, razorbills, and for our puffins. We do productivity. That's one of the big things. So for a lot of our species, we're monitoring their breeding success, how many eggs they're laying for our terns, how many burrows are active for our alcids, how many of the eggs they lay hatch, and how many of those chicks fledge. And then we're also looking at chick growth over the course of the season. And we do a lot of feeding studies. So we spent a lot of time looking at small fishes, seeing how our birds are eating and connecting that to how they're growing. And then we also do some sort of like population kind of stuff. So we'll do a lot of bird banding and then also what we call resighting. So looking with a scope, a spotting scope at our birds' legs and reading their bands so that we can identify who has returned to the island.
Wow. I think that's so much year after year, especially the feeding studies, like just imagining you all just sitting in those blinds for 3 hours at a time, just looking at tiny fish and trying to identify what they are and counting them too. It's so bizarre and amazing in all its all its ways. And I guess the productivity checks though is something that is really fascinating, I guess. So, could you talk a little bit more about that? What those individual data points kind of tell us? And yeah, I guess what does that look like for you on a daily basis?
Yeah, so we do productivity checks on our terns, on our puffins, our guillemots, and our razorbills. So for all of those species, we have a number of nests or burrows that we're monitoring. And for our terns, we have plots that have fencing around them, so the chicks stay inside that area until they can fly. And every other day, we go in and we measure them. So we'll weigh them, and then we also measure what we call their wing chord. It's a wing measurement that we do. And for our alcids, we are going around to a set of burrows that we know are pretty easy to look into, where we can confirm whether there are eggs in there or whether there are chicks in there. And then for a smaller number of those, we actually reach in and we pull the chicks out, and we will also weigh them and measure their wing length. And getting those two measurements, the weight and wing, give us a growth curve over the course of the season, so we can see the ratio of their weight to their wing length. And that can give us some information about how well the chicks are growing over the course of the season and whether they're fledging in a good body condition.
That's really interesting. I guess being in burrows makes the alces a lot harder to kind of do um, upkeep those prod checks. Having to grub the select few too is already a struggle. And now you have to measure all of them as well. And I guess kind of along the same lines of the resites and all the feeding studies, uh, maybe can we hear about why looking at the fish is so important to these alces?
Yeah, it's kind of always about fish at the end of the day. So there are other things that can impact how well our colony is doing. But for the chicks, what they need to grow well and to fledge from the island is really just enough food. And there are, we're trying to look at both what they're eating and how much they're eating. And there are these like peaks and valleys throughout the season sometimes of how much fish we're seeing, and there's always changes, as our viewers can see, even from just like the feedings that Amma is getting. There is variation throughout the season in what species of fish are being brought in by the adults. And we can look, so seeing the frequency of the feedings and seeing what the actual fishes or sometimes invertebrates are that they're feeding can tell us like how well the chicks are going to do often. And having the growth information and the fish information means that we can like connect those two things. So basically the chicks do well when the forage fish do well. So that's what we're looking for always.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess that kind of informs us on how the fish are doing too, because I always say it's really hard to count a bunch of tiny fish in the ocean, but it's a lot easier to count tiny fish in the mouths of these birds.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so I guess we can also talk about ways that the cam viewers can actually help with this science, especially on the loafing ledge.
Mhm.
They've probably noticed, a lot of birds actually have those metal bands around their legs, and that can actually, if the cameras can capture it well enough and the viewer's eyes sharp enough, can actually kind of show us what birds are hanging out there too. And so, yeah, could you maybe kind of talk more about resites and what that means?
Yeah. So most of our birds get banded with two bands. They have a USGS band on their right leg that has 9 digits, and they're pretty small, a little hard to read, but that's a unique band. that identifies that bird. And then they also have on the left leg typically what we call a field readable, and that has two letters and two numbers. And those are easier to see in the field because they're bigger. And so we spend a lot of time banding those chicks. And then hopefully in 2 to 5 years, when they come back, we're able to spot them out on the rocks. And so doing that resighting gives us an idea of the sort of adult survival rates of the birds. So we're able to see how many have made it through those tough years when they are a young bird out in the ocean and are actually coming back to breed. We have a big database of all of our birds that we banned. And so we get to go out in the field, write down all of our bands that we see, and then enter them into that database. And you get to see, where that bird has been, where it was banded, if it was banded on your island or on a different island, and then where it maybe has bounced around to before returning to actually breed somewhere. So we get a lot of information about their movements from resighting those bands. Yeah.
That's awesome. I guess with all of that in mind, leads us to our next part. So, how is the 2024 season going? What are some things that you've observed, things that you've noticed that might have changed?
Yeah, so this year has been a pretty good year overall for our puffins. So we have seen also some interesting fish and other things around. So we've had a really high frequency of feedings coming into the chicks, but a lot of our feedings are of slightly lower quality food. So very early on, we saw a lot of smelt and some hake. Smelt is pretty unusual in our puffins diet. And then as the season went on, it's been a lot of pink things. So we've had mostly haddock for our puffins, and that's a fish that used to be relatively rare in puffin diet, but in more recent years has come to comprise a pretty big proportion of it, especially in certain years. And then we've also continued to see some hake and redfish, and then also quite a few euphausids, which are also known as krill. And we've had huge euphausid feeding frenzies all around the island for the past couple of weeks. And so mostly our terns and gulls are eating those, but we also have been seeing some puffins foraging in those areas. And we've seen quite a few puffins come back with euphausids in their bills. They just look like little shrimp. And then just in the past few days, we've started to see some larger herring in the bills too. So it's always interesting to see how it changes and shifts. And the chicks are growing pretty well. They're well within the sort of this like what we think of as a normal growth pattern. So between our productivity checks, we do them every 5 days, and our chicks are growing, most of them about 40 to 60 grams between checks, and that's really solid. So I'm very happy to be seeing that. And as we started banding some of our bigger chicks, we've had multiple that are well over 300 grams, which is also really, really nice to see. And before long, they will be fledging. And this, yeah, which is crazy. Have it so fast. But yeah, probably in the next week or so, some of our chicks will start to fledge the island. We've found some that are nearly entirely feathered, so they're pretty ready to go.
Oh my gosh, look at that
this year,
phase.
yeah, this year has been pretty early for puffins. So we saw that last year too. It's pretty comparable this year. When we did our first productivity check, we found probably like over close to half of our burrows that had some level of activity in them already within the first week of May. So that's pretty similar to last year, but compared to the more like historical pattern, it's pretty early. But we've generally seen that birds who lay early tend to do better. So at least for now, it's sort of encouraging to see the puffins doing that.
And I guess something else that was a bit unprecedented this year was, I guess, the level of competition between birds over the burrows. For those of you who've been following along with the Puffin and the Guillemot burrow cams, know that there was quite a bit of drama, especially early on in the season for Willie and Millie. Over their burrow with an intruder coming in, briefly even taking over the island, or not the island, oh gosh, taking over the burrow and even rolling the egg out on its own. And so I guess, do you have any thoughts to share about if that's kind of a trend that you've been seeing or anything about that?
Yeah, so seeing the intruder attacks was uh a little disturbing to us just personally, but also really interesting to see. That is not something that I've ever seen before in the burrow, and the cam really gives us this unique view that we don't have of almost any other, certainly of any other puffin burrow on the island.
Mm.
Um, and it is true that typically when we have a lot of forage fish around, there's a lot to eat around the island. We get a lot more younger birds just spending time on the island, which in general is a good thing. You know, they're hanging out on the rocks, they're socializing, they're exploring burrows, they're trying to figure out where maybe they might nest in the future. But it also does mean that there are more birds who are just kind of getting up to no good under the rocks. And I think we have had, like this year, we've had a lot of food around. And so there are more younger birds who we've noticed just spending time on the island. And so it's not super surprising to me that we have seen a little bit more intruder action. And then also, you know, what we have is a pretty limited view, and what we're observing are individuals for right now. And so in the case of the Guillemot burrow, you know, that's an individual pair that's prospecting around in the burrow, and they've decided that they like that space. And they're a lot bigger than a Guillemot. They can push them around. And so that, you know, I don't have some sort of more intense explanation for that really. Um, they're just doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
It is definitely unusual to see so much in both of those burrows.
Mhm.
Actually, a guillemot flying behind me.
Yeah, I noticed that. That was adorable. But, I mean, it's great to see that Amma is just being a spunky little chick and kind of defending the burrow against possible intruders as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess you raised some really good points, and it's so great that the Explore cams are here to just give us a better view of what's going on. There's still a lot that we don't know about these charismatic seabirds. But the Seabird Institute is always looking to learn more, particularly through tracking where the birds go in the non-breeding season. Seabirds will fly hundreds or even thousands of miles across the world's oceans following the fish, but it's still a mystery where the younger birds go too. We still aren't certain if puffins migrate in groups or as individuals, and that's always something we're always trying to learn more about. So I heard from our researcher friends that there's an ongoing puffin tagging project that will hopefully teach us more about the mysterious ways of these alcids. And this may be related to a puffin that we saw earlier on the loafing ledge with a colorful band on its right leg. Coco, would you mind telling us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So we this year have put out GPS tags on puffins on Seal Island for the first time, but this is part of some work that was started a few years ago, and is now kind of spreading to some of the other islands and continuing. And it's part of a project that's focused on collecting this finer scale foraging data, which is connected to some of the offshore wind projects that are in development off the coast of Maine. We want to have more information about where all of our seabirds are going when they're getting food for their chicks and for themselves. And so these GPS tags are a way for us to find out a lot more about that. So yeah, we got 20 adults this year that had healthy looking chicks, and we put GPS tags on them. And now when the puffins are going out getting fish, coming back to the island. That GPS tag is pinging off of a base station here that is downloading that data. And then we're able to have someone process it and get foraging maps so we can see where our birds are going. And all of these birds has a unique combination of colored tape that are on the right leg band. So one of those birds is the one that was seen on the loafing ledge. I think it was red over white. So they each have either like a solid color or a color combination to distinguish them as individuals so they can be really easily identified. And so far, it's been really interesting to see some of like the very early data because we also have tagged terns on the island. So we have some common terns and some Arctic terns that have GPS tags. And so we're able to look at all of those different tracks for the different species laid on top of each other. And it has been really interesting to see this year that actually all of our species are foraging in pretty similar areas and heading southeast off the island, offshore, and typically going about 20 to 30 miles in that direction to forage and then coming back. But each individual has its own little track. They're doing their own thing. So yeah, it's really exciting work that they're doing and that we on the islands are getting to help with. And it's a way to learn a lot more than we can tell from here and with our human abilities.
Yeah, that's really cool, especially the 20 to 30 miles off the southeast of the island. I mean, from my time out on Seal, I didn't really observe any of the birds like heading out in that direction. So that's actually really interesting to hear about. And just as a reminder for those of you who are watching, Coco will be answering questions that come in through tonight's live event. So let's keep them coming. And if your question doesn't get answered tonight, we will do our best to get answers for you in the comments or in our future live events. And I guess we can move on to some of our question sections. And I'll just start with a question that I think many viewers have been thinking about. So what is the banding process like for the guillemots and the razorbills? We've seen banded gillies on the guillemot burrow cam, but those only have one band. And what determines if a gillie gets banded or not? And what about the razorbills?
Those are great questions. So our guillemots just get a USGS band on them on their right leg. And here we only band our guillemots that are in productivity burrows. So we have a set of burrows that we check on the island. And so a bird that is banded is probably a bird that was a chick in one of those burrows at some point on the island. And then the razorbills, we actually do not band at all here. So there are projects where they're putting bands on razorbills, but we have a pretty small population still. It is growing, but we only have just under 100 active burrows on the island. And the razorbills also get a very special kind of band because they spend so much time sitting on their legs. They actually have a triangular band. And so they're a little bit more difficult to get. So for now, we're not banding them.
That's interesting. Yeah, especially I feel like we've noticed a lot of the razorbills out on the loafing ledge do sit quite differently than the puffins do, who stand a lot more often. And so it's really cool that the bands are kind of adapted to make them more comfortable too. Um, yeah. And so our next question is from Dancing Queens, and they want to know about the banded puffin chicks from the Explore camera burrows. So the question is, we're waiting for the return of our first two red banded burrow babies. We want to confirm that only our Seal Island burrow fledglings have the red color bands. Is that correct?
Yes, I love the passion in the all caps here. Yes, so I know people have seen some other videos and things or images of puffins with colored bands. So many years ago, they did put out these plastic field readable bands that were colored on puffins, but most of those are sort of not in circulation anymore. And so only the single chick from the cam burrow is getting banded with this type of band now. So if we see one of those, we will definitely know right away.
Mhm. And I think we had another question come in from a viewer who wanted to know, these chicks have been recited before. Is that right? And I think the answer is yes. And they've even been seen on the loafing ledge, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So keep your eyes peeled, viewers. There's always a chance you may see one of our lovely burrow chicks. And speaking of banded burrow chicks, the Seal Island team just banded and took measurements for Alma, who is the 2024 on-cam Puffin burrow chick. So in case you missed it, here are some photos. Alma measured at a whopping 317 grams with a wing chord measurement of 111 millimeters. And Paula A would like to know, are these measurements typical for a young puffin at Alma's age?
Yeah, these are really good measurements. So I was really happy to see her weight and wing chord. So she still does have a little ways to grow before she's ready to fledge. Her wings will probably need to be more in the like 125 to 135 millimeter range. But she is looking healthy and well feathered.
That is great to hear.
Yeah.
Um, she's looking always so adorable too in that lovely new sleeping position she has adopted. You can see quite elongated now. So Kathy G has a question from observing Amma as well as other puffin chicks. So she asks, as chicks, their eyes look very wide and wide open, circular. As an adult, they seem to have more crescent-shaped eyes. What is that, and when does that develop?
So I think what you're describing in this question is that as chicks, we just see their like round eye, which is very dark. And then as adults, we see them here only in their breeding plumage. And so they have this sort of eye ornamentation. And so their eye is like the same shape. Um, but then they have like these the like overall shape of that ornament around their eye makes it maybe look kind of crescent shaped. But they only have those with their breeding plumage.
Interesting. I guess it can be kind of like growing out mascara year after year, kind of that ornamentation.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting, like that crease that they have in those eyes are kind of like the result of their feathers kind of clumping together to form a line. And so what you're seeing is actually things that are on the outside of their face instead of rather kind of their eye shape changing, if that makes sense. Um, all right, so that's it for the questions that we've prepared. So with what all we've learned tonight, I have one last important question for you, Coco. I'd like to ask, what is your favorite alcid to study and why?
The hardest question.
The
I
best
do
for last.
I do really love them all. They're all different. We definitely do the most work with our puffins, and so we have kind of the widest variety of things that we get to do with them, which is exciting. But I do really love our razor bills, and something that's really exciting is that their population has really been increasing on the island. So around 10 years ago, there were only 20 burrows that we knew about on the island, and now I think we're at 99 this year that we've confirmed as active. And so it's been really exciting to see their numbers go up on the island. And then also because the chicks fledge so early, they're kind of extra precious because we only get a few weeks when we get to see them around. And then the razorbill, all the adults, like once the chicks have fledged, they leave the island much earlier than the other alcids too. So we really have to appreciate them extra while they're here because we know we won't have them for very long.
Yeah, that's such a good reason for that too. And I feel like razorbills are not really well known just because they're not seen as often as the guillemots or even the puffins because I don't know. They just don't have that charismatic thing that the puffins do, but they really should because they are just so cool. And I love how the inside of their mouths are just bright orange too. It kind of
Yeah.
reaffirms that Alcid connection. Yeah, so that's amazing. And the fact that they're kind of, I think they're the closest related to the great auk too, the now
Wow.
extinct bird that was once found in the Atlantic as well. And it makes them so much cooler as well. Um, but yeah, thank you everyone for your questions. Now we can move on to questions that came in during tonight's live chat. All right. So see what the first question is. So we have a question from a viewer. Why did the puffins intrude on the guillemot burrow repeatedly if they had no interest in nesting there themselves?
Well, I'd love to tell you what they were thinking, but we don't know. Um, but they may actually have an interest in nesting there themselves. So when young puffins are coming back to the island, they'll often return a couple of years before they're actually ready to breed here. And so they'll spend time on the island, socializing with each other, courting each other, and also exploring potential spots for themselves to nest later on. And so my assumption from the behavior that we've seen both last year and this year is that that is a new pair of younger birds. And so they might be just sort of spending time there and exploring in the burrow before they commit to potentially nesting there.
That makes sense. And I think this year's kind of behavior was exacerbated just because the guillemot pair themselves also seemed pretty young, and weren't the best at defending themselves like we've seen in previous years with the guillemots. And so it's just a matter of who is in the burrow at the right time. If this is the right space for them, it's just kind of how it plays out, unfortunately. All right. So I think this is related to the incident that they were talking about with the Guillemot burrow. So on the Guillemot cam, we experienced an adult puffin killing the Guillemot chick within hours after it hatched. So we know animals can kill for hunting or territory, which might be what happened at the Gilly burrow. Has the team been able to verify if there are a pair of puffins nesting near the Gilly burrow? I guess this is like kind of asking about territory.
Yeah, so those puffins, I would guess, are not actually nesting already because if they were nesting, they would be committed to their burrow. So the puffins will all nest like really pretty close together within their little burrow complexes, and they'll nest close to guillemots as well. And so they're not typically concerned with sort of burrow territory that's outside of their actual own burrow. So I do think that this is a pair that doesn't have their own burrow yet. So they're exploring different spots. Um, and so these birds, it's really upsetting to see things like this. And we really want to have an explanation that makes sense to us, that fits within a framework. And to a certain extent, that behavior does, because we know that these puffins are probably looking for burrow spaces. There is a lot of space on the island, but there are some spaces that are better than others. And so there is some competition for a good burrow, basically. But the other thing is we're watching individuals. And when you spend a lot of time, seeing this big colony, you see individuals do weird things. And they don't always fit into some explanation that's really clear to us, especially to our human brains compared to their bird brains. And so seeing something that seems really senseless is difficult for sure. And there might not be some really distinct reason that that bird acted that way that we can understand for us. Um, but sometimes these things just happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that. And we have a question. When these birds are not breeding, do they spend their time primarily at sea?
Yes. So we think of the birds as being like our island birds, but they actually spend a minority of their time on the island and they are more comfortable on the ocean. So they will go back out to sea when they are done breeding. And they will spend most of the winter just sort of, especially for the puffins, like floating around on the ocean.
Great. Here's a question about the murre. So, do the murres have the same nesting habits as the puffins and razorbills? And where do they nest?
They have somewhat similar, somewhat different. The murres, so there are some murres that are nesting on our sort of sister island on Matinicus Rock. They had nested there historically. They were extirpated along with a lot of our other seabirds from that area. And then after about 100 years, they now have a small colony that is growing there. The murres will nest typically even more colonially, so they like to be all crammed up together with each other. We might have seen pictures from the UK where they're nesting on more like ledges where there'll be hundreds and hundreds of birds all together. Out here, they're still nesting in sort of slightly more open burrow areas together. And then they will also have their chicks go out to sea, like the razorbills, with an adult and get fed on the water.
Interesting. I'd love to see more questions about murres. Um, and I guess to talk about kind of the checkups that you were kind of speaking of earlier, will Alma be measured and weighed again?
She will not. So Mama has had her little stressful time outside of the burrow with us, where we love her, and she maybe doesn't love us the same way. But she will not be measured again before she fledges. So she got her one time experience, and then let her go out to sea by herself.
Awesome. Well, we will continue observing and
Yeah,
watching her get bigger and bigger and ready to fledge then.
yeah.
Um, all right. So I think this might be our last question from the viewer Q&As. So, what makes a bird an alcid?
So alcids are birds that are in the alcid family or the auk family. And so it's a variety of species. They're all in the larger order Charadriformes. And they all like share a bunch of different traits. Um, but part of it's just like part of their like family tree kind of.
Mhm. Yeah. And just to kind of add on to that, some other birds that you may know from the alcid family are dovekies, the other guillemot species that you may see, including murres, which some of us may call guillemots from across the pond in the UK, and murrelets as well. And they all kind of have that black and white kind of counter shading coloration to them. And all right, so I think that wraps up our questions. Thank you everyone for submitting such amazing questions. For any of those that we couldn't get to, keep asking away on our Asana form or in the comments. And I will get to them in a future feature comment or elsewhere in the chat. And of course, a huge thank you to our amazing guest, Coco, for being here, not just tonight, but for all of your hard work this season. The work that Coco does on Seal Island through the Seabird Institute informs real, lasting decisions that we can make to improve the lives of seabirds and the health of our oceans. Without amazing researchers like her and her team, our project would just not be possible. Thank you for all of your hard work and dedication, and of course, for joining us today. Um, do you maybe have any last words that you want to add?
I just want to say a quick word of appreciation to all of our cam viewers. You all are so dedicated to these birds, and we love how much you love them.
And thank you all for tuning in tonight. As always, it's such a pleasure to hear your comments and questions. Please look forward to the next edition of these live chats. And in the meantime, stay tuned to all of the Audubon Seabird Institute's live cams hosted on explore.org. Many of our puffin and tern chicks are reaching that fledging age, which is really exciting, and they're growing in their waterproof flight feathers very nicely. So don't miss it. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.